Do you ever feel that no matter how hard you study, you just can't seem to make any progress? You're putting in the hours, but the results doesn't add up. You can't seem to retain what you study. Now, if you happen to be facing this challenge, this video was made exactly for you. Now, the true essence of studying smarter and not harder is not just about improving your current study habits, but actually going against conventional wisdom. A lot of people think highlighting their textbooks until 90% of the textbook is littered with highlighters would actually lead to progress. Or some people might think rereading a chapter or a text would actually lead to retention. But more often than not, when you follow conventional wisdom, it most times leads to conventional or average results. Now, I'll be sharing with you 4 study techniques that can help you transform your studying. Now, let's get into the video. Now, the first strategy is something called active recall. Now, some people think that just because they've read a material, they automatically have it ingrained in their brains. Now, the thing is that when we have that kind of mindset towards reading, we are liable to fall into a trap known as the recognition fallacy. Now, this is when you are reading, you recognize the terms, but when the chips are down and you are asked to actually explain what you've just read, all we're gonna hear are crickets. Now, what active recall helps you to do is to actually prevent you from actually falling into this recognition fallacy. Now, active recall is basically you actively engaging with the material, asking yourself questions on what you've read while you read. Let's say you are learning about biology and you just finished reading photosynthesis. To actually practice active recall, you close the book and ask yourself, what is photosynthesis? Now, there are countless scientific studies that actually back the effects of active recall, because when you actively recall, it forces you to actually pay more attention and allows you to stimulate the neural pathways that information was stored. And the more those pathways are strengthened, which actually makes it easier to recall the same information in future.
And guys, if you're getting a ton of value from this video, please don't forget to hit the like button. It helps with the algorithm. Now let's continue.
Which then leads us to the next strategy, spaced repetition. Now, this strategy actually has its roots from an experiment done by a psychologist known as Hermann Ebbinghaus. Now, Ebbinghaus basically wanted to find out the rate at which humans forget, and he conducted a series of experiments on himself. Now, what was discovered was that humans actually tend to forget exponentially, which actually leads to something called the forgetting curve, to the point where 24 hours after you finish reading a material, you are most likely going to forget 50% of that material. That's how crazy it is. Now, how do we actually offset this radical rate of forgetting? Now, that's where spaced repetition actually comes into play. Spaced repetition is when you space the time where you refresh a material. Now, ideally, the first repetition should be done at least 24 hours after you study the material. The really interesting thing is that the more you refresh your memory, it actually reduces the rate at which you forget. Now, that's where the idea of spaced repetition comes. The more you repeat it, the more you increase the spacing between your repetitions. Now, during my research on this strategy, I came across a really interesting term known as synaptic plasticity. There's something in your brain known as synapses, and your synapses are linkages to neurons. The more you engage this activity, the more you actually fire the synapses and stimulate the synaptic connections, which actually helps you to increase the chances that that information will be stored in your long-term memory. Now, for those of us who tend to study the night before the exam, you would actually tend to fall into the pit hole of la cram, la pour, la forget. But when you actually engage spaced repetition, spaced throughout the semester, the information ceases to become a one-time affair, but something that will carry you through way after you finish school. Which then leads us to another technique, which is known as the Pomodoro technique. And the Pomodoro technique is basically when you think of time not in hours, but instead in tomatoes. I know it actually sounds weird. Now, the meaning of Pomodoro in Italian means tomatoes. How do you actually use this technique? Is basically to set a timer for 25 minutes of focused work and then have a 5-minute break. So one Pomodoro is essentially 30 minutes of time. And anything beyond 4 Pomodoros in a study session would warrant a 15 to 10-minute break. Now, one of the advantages of the Pomodoro technique is that it actually gamifies studying, and also it reduces the risk of burnout, mental fatigue, and procrastination. And now, on that word procrastination, a research was actually done. This was actually during the COVID-19 period, during the lockdown, where students were actually tested on the effectiveness of the Pomodoro technique. And what was discovered that it drastically reduced the likelihood that they were able to procrastinate, because when you think about tasks in terms of pomodoros. Instead of saying I'm going to spend 2 hours on this task, you can just say I'm going to spend 1 pomodoro on this. And 1 pomodoro can eventually lead to 2 pomodoros. And 2 pomodoros can eventually lead to 4 pomodoros. 4 pomodoros equals 2 hours. So when you actually think of time that way, it kind of breaks down the task in your head and makes it more likely for you to actually do the task and reduces the odds that you procrastinate on that task. Which then leads us to the 4th strategy, which is the Feynman technique. The Feynman technique was actually brought about by an award-winning physicist known as Richard Feynman. Now, this technique basically involves 4 steps, whereby you pick a concept that you want to study. Now, take for example, let's say you're studying biochemistry and you're learning about aerobic respiration. Now, within the topic of aerobic respiration, it's actually further broken down into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Now, for the Feynman technique, you can decide that, okay, I'm going to focus on the Krebs cycle. Basically, you picking the concept and then writing every single thing that you know about that topic, or you teach it to someone else. Now, in the process of actually writing it down or teaching it, you then discover the gaps in your knowledge. And then when you discover these gaps, you then fill those gaps by engaging the source material, basically reading the source material or the textbook to help to fill in the gaps in your knowledge. Now, when you fill in the gaps in your knowledge, the 4th step is to refine your explanations and to create analogies to the explanations that you've made. Now, what this Feynman technique does exceedingly well is that it actually helps to guard against something called the illusion of knowledge, which is quite similar to the recognition fallacy. When you think you know something, but in reality you actually do not know it and you cannot reproduce it when called upon. The Feynman technique actually helps you to have a much more deeper understanding of whatever it is that you are currently learning. And guys, if you like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button. It helps with the algorithm. And if you like this video, I think you're really going to love this video about how to study every single day. And with that, guys, remember to always keep it real. Bye, guys.